two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Nick Wilson, a student organizer with Cornell YDSA. Nick, welcome.
Yeah, I'm an organizer with Cornell's Young Democratic Socialists of America, which is a group of left-wing students on campus. And Cornell YDSA is one of over 40 student organizations that are members of the Cornell Coalition for Mutual Liberation, which is the broad-based anti-imperialist coalition on campus. It includes political organizations like YDSA and Cornell Progressives, alongside identity-based organizations like Black Students United and the Latin American Students Alliance, alongside other organizations. I'm going into my third year at Cornell, and I was involved heavily since October in the student pro-Palestine movement up at Cornell.
Nick Wilson, can you summarize the situation in Palestine and especially Gaza?
Yeah, certainly something that's difficult to put in brief, but I think certainly since 1948, with the establishment of the State of Israel by European powers, people in Palestine and Gaza and the West Bank have lived under occupation. They're denied the ability to move freely about, the ability to enjoy the same civil rights and liberties as other civilians in Israel, and generally have been subject to brutal military occupation and expanding colonialism that has sort of encroached further and further upon sovereign Palestinian territory in those areas. The events that are most germane to what we're talking about today is sort of the most recent expansion of Israel's constant assault on life in Palestine. It's one of countless examples now of Israel encroaching further upon the sovereignty of Palestine. But in this instance was a reaction to the events of October 7th, where elements of the Palestinian resistance moved beyond the borders of Gaza and into Israel, in insurgence against the Israeli state. The response to that has been, I would say, disproportionate and genocidal in nature. Israel has been actively targeting civilians and has been directly involved in the deaths of close to 40,000 civilians across Gaza now. They've been destroying civilian homes, medical and aid infrastructure, and targeting basically every facet of civilian life in Gaza, as well as capturing political prisoners who have been held in concentration camp-like environments. So the genocide in Gaza is ongoing and is part of a historical process that has been continuing on for many years. But it's been since October that many experts have described what's going on as a genocide that's being carried out by the Israeli state, and of course backed up by the United States government, which continues to provide unconditional military aid to the Israeli military as this goes on.
Another thing that we hear about is Israel has been targeting Palestinian and numerous journalists have been killed. I think well over 100. And it goes
Yeah.
on all the time. So that was one more thing. Targeting also UN aid workers and volunteer aid workers from volunteer organizations. So it's been quite a round of atrocities. And how does Cornell relate to all this? What has the university's role been?
The role is actually, fairly directly linear. The companies that are arming the Israeli military are arms manufacturers that are overwhelmingly US based and that are providing contracts that are paid for through arms sales by the US government. Companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and a number of others. The modern university, private universities, in reality operate a lot like hedge funds. The core of the university and where that value is are endowments that are, on the scale of hundreds of billions of dollars in these larger elite environments. And these endowments include investments across the economy, but are heavily invested in weapons manufacturers. So at Cornell, there are 10 weapons manufacturers that we've demanded Cornell divest from, so pull back their capital that's funding the continued operation of these American firms that are arming the Israeli genocide. At Cornell, it actually goes even a step further than some of these other private universities that have just investment holdings in defense manufacturers. Cornell has multiple research programs through its Jacobs Technion Institute, through which it directly facilitates the research and development of new Israeli military technology jointly with the IDF. One example of that is the D4 unmanned bulldozer, which is a modified bulldozer that's able to be operated remotely. And it's been used by the Israeli military to strategically, intentionally destroy the homes of civilians in Gaza so that they're not able to return after military assaults. One of the most direct and sort of brutal examples of how the Israeli military is destroying elements of Gazan life. And it's something that our university here in Ithaca, that's so familiar to us, is directly facilitating and making possible. So the core demand of the encampment, and as we can maybe dig into a little bit later, there was sort of a group of demands that we all felt were associated with that core demand. But the central call of our encampment, as well as the protests that took place at other universities, was divestment from those weapons manufacturers and an end to those programs through which Cornell is complicit or directly contributes to the Israeli military's occupation of Gaza.
Yes, and I know there have been all sorts of community protests about this also. I mean, years ago, I remember marching with Catholic Worker against the cooperation with the Technion, which is actually mainly in New York City. More recently, downtown. What I remember is these several Ithacans in bear suits with red t-shirts over them and the word complicit. It was fun. I can't quite remember. It was one of the downtown festivals when that took place. And it was cool enough weather that it looked pretty comfortable to be wearing a bear suit.
Yeah, Action for Liberation, Jewish Voice for Peace, a number of community organizations have contributed a lot to the student movement and have even pushed us a little bit further with their work down in Ithaca. So it's definitely been a collaborative movement between the two.
Well, at the encampment, you had, you might say, a finite group of students and a very few staff and faculty joining you in the encampment. But where do those groups, faculty, staff, students, stand in a broader way?
Yeah, so we're lucky at Cornell, I think, to have a better indicator of where the overwhelming majority of students stand on the issue, relative to just the students that participate in the encampment, because we were able to get a resolution passed through the Cornell Student Assembly, where all students had the opportunity to vote on two core demands, having Cornell call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza and divesting from those 10 weapons manufacturers. It was a non-binding referendum, but it was the first referendum that had been called in over 20 years by the Student Assembly, and there was overwhelming participation. 49% of students voted in the referendum as the result of both sides canvassing students pretty heavily. But for Cornell, that's a pretty overwhelming result. It's a very apolitical campus. In the last Student Assembly election, only 15% of students voted. So it was a significant uptick and showed a lot of student interest. In that election, over 70% of students voted both to divest and to call for a ceasefire, which I think coming into the encampment was a strong indicator that the majority of the student body was behind us, and that the administration's suggestion that the demand of divestment was unreasonable or was something that the majority of students didn't stand behind. The idea that it was a small number of agitators calling for this, I think, was dispelled pretty quickly. Not only did activists know how large our base was, but ordinary Cornell students realized how overwhelmingly their peers stood with the people of Gaza, and how much they supported the demands of divestment and calling for a ceasefire.
So you mentioned a little bit about the Cornell response, namely skepticism to a very, well, to a referendum, you might say, that was quite broadly, uh, had pretty broad participation. And what about Cornell's position in general?
This year, Cornell found themselves in an interesting bind. After last year, students organized to kick Ann Coulter off campus when she appeared for a speaking engagement. The administration came together for a huddle and decided that this past academic year would be the free expression theme year, and that there would be events and programs and these T-shirts that were celebrating the idea of freedom of expression. And as with many liberal organizations, I think the Palestine exception became very clear very quickly. In November, after protests began kicking off in solidarity with Palestine, Cornell introduced their interim expressive speech policy, the IEAP, which effectively restricted all forms of recognizable protest, dictated that students could organize from noon to 1 p.m. outside 2 locations on campus with approval. Those students could not use amplified sound. They could not have open flames. If they had signs, they needed to label their signs with the organization that they were affiliated with. Uh, and a number of just increasingly extreme impositions that made effective protest completely impossible. You know, protest that exists on the terms of the people being protested, obviously not effective. So that anti-speech policy has been weaponized numerous times against students over the course of protests that have been happening since October across campus in various forms. But I think it certainly came to a head in March when Cornell made the decision to arrest 24 members of the Cornell community, 22 students and 2 members of staff in a sit-in, rolled out CUPD and charged us in the Ithaca court system, which I think certainly was an escalation of their anti-speech crackdown and was an expression of where exactly they stood, on our demands.
So it sounds a bit like a free speech, no speech position.
Did seem like it.
And so ultimately, as I recall, late April, students took a big action.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, around the country, we had seen our peers at universities like Columbia, like Cal Poly Humboldt, and countless schools across the country putting up encampments and permanently occupying spaces on campus around this sort of rallying cry of divestment and solidarity with Palestine. And I think, especially after seeing our peers at Columbia put one up, we recognized the mandate that was behind us in light of the referendum and the overwhelming support across campus, and felt that we were ready to do the same, and that it was what was going to be necessary to escalate the issue, raise it to the point that Cornell had to engage with us, had to respond in some capacity. And so around 4 a.m., we pitched tents and started our encampment at Cornell. The encampment ended up lasting until the end of the academic year for a little over 2 weeks. But yeah, it became a really incredible space, not just as a protest activity, but just as a place for students to be and to learn more about these issues and to apply pressure to the university. I think it was very special to be part of this kind of national escalation of the fight for Palestine.
My husband and I went up and visited a few times. We never went in, but a couple of times we brought food. So we had in a very small way, we participated. I guess you might say he as a professor emeritus and me as a community member. And
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was really special during the encampment was seeing all the support from community, from students at Ithaca College, from staff members, from faculty members. I think the administration, when they make statements that like a lot of us disagree with, or that find them very unsettling, it's expressed as this is the position of the university. And during the encampment, we found actually that when we come together with the people that we live with here in Ithaca and with the students that are in the same position as us, we actually don't really need the administration to ensure that students are fed, that they're taken care of, that they're, learning things that are really important and will guide their lives in a meaningful direction to, in the words of Ezra Cornell, do the greatest good. So we were definitely blown away by just like the overwhelming support from people outside of the Cornell community and people within the community. It was definitely an action that was totally sustained by solidarity from all directions.
yeah, I mean, I remember conversations like a conversation with some, fellow activist from the community. I haven't seen so and so for quite a while. Oh, she was just here. uh, saw a lot of our friends and fellow activists, you might say. We got little glimpses of life inside. I mean, we were there on a Friday evening, for instance, and they were preparing to hold a Jewish service in the encampment. So perhaps you could tell us a little more about all the things that went on inside the encampment.
Yeah, it was really special to see, I mean, ultimately the central goal of the encampment, it's a protest tactic that, raises attention and attempts to, sort of raise the stakes for Cornell in the fight for divestment. But the experience of the encampment was something that really was special, I think. Something that we talk about all the time at Cornell, just normally, is how sort of lonely and isolating the culture here can be. It's very competitive. People are very atomized from one another, in particular students who really fight tooth and nail to get in and retain that kind of competitive spirit in addressing their peers when they get here. But inside the encampment, I think we created what we eventually sort of came to calling the People's University, in line with what the Columbia students had established. Of it was the kind of university that we'd like to imagine and that we think can be realized if we empower students and we empower the voices of the people who make the institution what it is. There were students there who were learning and who were making music and art with their peers and were discussing what was happening in Gaza and how they felt and getting, a pedagogical experience that I think in lots of cases was a lot more meaningful and will stick with them for a long time, more so than sitting in a lecture hall in that moment. And we had faculty members who were coming and sharing their expertise and their knowledge of the events in Gaza and knowledge of other events. There was a ton of discussion of what's happening in the Congo right now and other, imperial struggles across the world that never would have been brought up in our classrooms outside of those contexts. And then as well, as you mentioned, cultural experiences, in particular, a large segment of the Jewish community that was participating in the encampment as a part of Jewish Voice for Peace. They held just before the encampment, cropped up the Freedom Seder, which was a large celebration of sort of the intersection of Jewish values and liberation, and anti-imperialism, anti-racism. So yeah, seeing students from all cultures, from all backgrounds, sort of celebrating their culture in a way that wasn't co-opted by the university, that could be fully political and fully oriented in a direction that was about liberation, it was about justice. It was something that was really beautiful. Professor Russell Rickford, who was present for a large portion of the encampment, wrote a beautiful piece for the Cornell Sun talking about the power of the encampment. And the thing he pointed out that sort of stuck with me was the idea that, students were creating in the encampment the kind of university that we wanted to see. And for a time we did, because we were present in the encampment and not in our classrooms. And we were generating a model of liberatory education, I think, alongside students all across the country at universities. that was engaged with community and was really powerful. And I think will stick with every student who even spent a day at the encampment for the rest of our lives.
So we've heard a lot about the encampment, and I think it was a very multicultural place and a very friendly place, uh, though sometimes the weather wasn't so friendly. That comes with the turf, quite literally. Uh, how did Cornell respond to the encampment?
Not positively. Very quickly after we set up the encampment, we were approached by sort of a delegation of administrators, around five upper level officials who certainly gave the impression that post-Columbia, they anticipated something like this would be happening. And so I imagine they had been in their boardrooms cooking up, what their response would be. The genius strategy that they had put together was they told us the encampment could continue to stay up for a week on the condition that we relocate to the former location of the 1980s anti-South African apartheid encampments, which is right near Day Hall, which on one hand, we certainly appreciated them drawing the historical connection and illustrating that all fights against apartheid are, part of the same struggle. It was an interesting acknowledgement from the administration, but we'll take it nonetheless. But the location itself was clearly inferior to the one that we had selected. We had, set up on the Art Squad, which is the most visible, sort of recognizable area of Cornell's campus. It's somewhere all the tours go through. It's very beautiful and old, but it's also open. It's got numerous points of entry and exit. It's flat, which means that in resisting the elements, there are fewer hazards to worry about. The area they had suggested only had 2 points of entry and exit, so should they have elected to sweep it with police, it would have been very easy for them to clear folks out. It was heavily slanted, which meant that if there were rainfall, it would be very easy for tents to be, disrupted or destroyed. And generally, it was a location that was kind of secluded and packed off into its own corner of campus. So we refused to move from the art squad. And from there, the university became increasingly angry. On the first day of the encampment, they told us on 3 different occasions, if you do not leave by this time, we will begin making arrests and issuing disciplinary violations. The first two were complete hoaxes, but the third one we became more nervous around. And that was a deadline that was set for 8 p.m. So that night, on the first night of the encampment, after we had set up, we put out a call at 7:30 for community allies, other students, anyone who was on campus, to join us and to resist the possibility of a police sweep. And I was hopeful that our community would show out to support us, but I had no idea how overwhelming it would be that first night. We estimate it was in excess of 300 community members who linked arms, encircled the encampment, and formed 3 full layers of community members who were chanting and singing and showing their solidarity with us, probably for 3 hours of that night, starting around 7:30 and going into the evening. So I believe solely due to the power of that community unity that we were able to pull together. No arrests were made that first night, no suspensions were issued, and we were able to make it clear through that first night. From there, things remained relatively stable. The university eventually came to the negotiating table, though I believe they negotiated in bad faith. They didn't treat us with respect or sort of acknowledge the importance of the demands. We were met with the same kinds of dismissive remarks that we were met with back in November when we occupied Day Hall. The Coalition for Mutual Liberation has assembled a 30-page research paper on the details of our demands and how it would be implemented by Cornell administration if they accepted. And we knew that the administration was telling us lies about the ways that the investment process operated. So the negotiation process didn't go anywhere, but we did, make it to the table and get to the point where we were speaking with the president and upper level administration.
I did not make it out to that first call for community support, but then a few days later, I think there was a weekend, and I remember coming. And at that point, Cornell had come down, you might say, very heavily on a small number of people, and you were one of them. So I think I would like to hear about that and what the end of that was.
A couple days into the encampment, I was returning from taking a meeting or doing an interview in a building, and I was walking back out on the art squad, and I had a friend run up to me and say, check your email, check your email. And so I did open my email, and I found a notice from Cornell's Office of Student Code and Community Standards that I had been temporarily suspended from the university. Alongside at that time, 4 others. The next day, 2 more would join us. But we were issued notices notifying us that we had been temporarily withdrawn from all of our classes and that we were no longer welcome on university property. There was a note towards the bottom of the notice that said temporary exceptions may be granted upon request for student housing and for student dining facilities. And as a student who at that time lived on campus in a dorm and depended upon the student dining hall services, obviously that was a point of great concern. Eventually, some days later, the university brought all 4 of the suspended students individually into meetings with the Office of Student Conduct. And we were given effectively a deal saying we would be able to receive credit for the previous semester, which at this point, we had completed months of work for all of our courses. We had maybe a final paper or a final exam to take, but little more than that at that point. And we were told we would be able to receive credit for those courses, complete the remaining work at another date, if we signed on to an agreement saying that we wouldn't support in any way the encampment. I clarified in that meeting with the director of the Office of Student Conduct whether that would include speaking to the media in a way that encouraged students to join the encampment. She said yes. I told her that one of my best friends was involved in organizing another encampment at another university. I asked if providing private advice to him on organizing that encampment would violate that agreement. And she also said yes to that. So at that point, I deemed that, I couldn't in good faith sign on to an agreement that would constrict my speech so heavily. And frankly, was taken aback that in the year of freedom of expression, they would be holding a student's semester hostage,
You've survived in any case. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I have been speaking with Nick Wilson. I'm Theresa Alt.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.